Everyone talks about the strongest militaries in the world. However, I find the other end of the list much more interesting. So here are the 6 weakest armies in the world. Number 6. North Macedonia. Being in the middle of the powder keg that is the Balkans most often means you should have a formidable army that can protect you from the ambitions of your neighbors. Ever since the 19th century, these guys have had something to split among themselves. Each country claims parts of its neighbors, and unfortunately for them, North Macedonia is in the middle of this boiling pot. One would think that a country that claims a third of Greece, a considerable part of Western Bulgaria, and to top it all off, has some unresolved issues with both Albania and Serbia, will bolster one of the strongest militaries in the region. Alas, they not only have by far the weakest military force in the region, but one of the weakest armies in the entire world. To be honest, geography wasn't too kind to North Macedonia in the first place. For starters, the country has no ports and is entirely landlocked. Moreover, it has one of the smallest populations in Europe, with only 2.1 million citizens. Of them, only 782,000 are fit for service. Now that's not too bad if North Macedonia had the means to supply and prepare them for battle. However, just like most other former communist countries, North Macedonia has a huge problem with corruption, which bites off a huge chunk of the already thin defense budget. So North Macedonia can support only 6,850 active soldiers. Speaking of the defense budget, for 2023 the country has dedicated just over $292 million. In contrast, just a single B-2 Spirit bomber costs $2 billion. Their military budget is equal to 30 Abram M1 tanks. Coincidentally, they actually have only 31 tanks, 19 of which are operational. In 2001, Bulgaria donated 10 of its tanks to North Macedonia during the Albanian incursion. However, almost all North Macedonian equipment is old Soviet relics, most of which are barely functional. So they only have T-72A tanks, which proved highly inefficient in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Still, they do have some more modern armored vehicles from Greece, Germany, and the US, but all of them are still outdated and in questionable condition. When it comes to the Air Force, the North Macedonian capabilities are, let's say, limited. They have 0 fighter jets, 0 attack-type planes, and 0 transporters. You might think that they actually have no Air Force at all, but that's not true. North Macedonia boasts 10 trainer jets, of which 6 are active, and 10 transport helicopters, of which also 6 are active. So it's a damn lie that the great descendants of Alexander the Great, as they proudly proclaim themselves to be, have no Air Force. Unfortunately, it only numbers 350 personnel, so yeah, not too intimidating. So how does North Macedonia even exist? Well, it's the balance of powers. Everyone from its neighbors, except for Kosovo, would love to have a bite from their territory. Thus, if someone dares to try, the rest will jump right in to stop it. So if Bulgaria or Albania try something, Serbia and Greece will intervene, and the other way around. As you can imagine, that's not the best solution for a nation's independence. So the North Macedonian government took a bold step in joining NATO in 2020. Today, the country of 2 million has about 60% of the global economy and around 7 million troops defending its territory. Moreover, 3 of its 5 neighbors are also part of the alliance. So the country is well protected, despite having an army that's one brick wall decor away from being a stand-up comedy prop. Looking at North Macedonia and its defense budget, one would think that a rich country would never have such problems. Well, you're in for a surprise. Number 5. Luxembourg. Being a buffer state definitely helps security, as Luxembourg is snuggled between 2 of Europe's biggest superpowers, France and Germany. Still, the small landlocked country does have the manpower to compete. With one of the smallest populations in the world, its army couldn't compare with any of its neighbors, even if all 90,000 fit for service were called for duty. Although it may seem pointless to even keep an army at this point, Luxembourg proudly boasts a 1,000 personnel active force. Why? It's anyone's guess. Moreover, the country has 0 tanks, 0 artillery, and only 180 military vehicles. As a landlocked country, they have no navy and don't have enough space to build a genuine operational air base, so they lack an air force. Not to mention that they lack any strategic resources. Thankfully for them, however, Western Europe has forsaken its barbaric past, and Luxembourg's independence is not in danger. Moreover, even if that wasn't the case, France and Germany would likely try to avoid another world war for a piece of land with no strategic value. So, with the lack of personnel, equipment, air force, and even bases, why does Luxembourg allocate $460 million on defense annually? That's more than North Macedonia, despite having far less personnel and equipment. Well, I guess the 1,000 people on duty are very well paid. And what a cushy job it is. Still, with this modest military strength, Luxembourg still boasts a far more formidable army than what's coming next. Number 4. Panama. It's quite unfair to talk about how weak Panama's army is, as they practically don't have one. Yes, Panama's main force was disbanded in 1990 after the United States invaded and disposed General Noriega with the help of local paramilitary units and rebellious groups led by Lieutenant Colonel Moses Girol de Vera. The bloody coup against Noriega was successful, and the Panama Defense Force was disbanded. In its place, Panama instituted a new form of defense that's much more oriented toward internal affairs rather than external. Thus, they do actually have a 27,000 paramilitary unit, which takes care of protecting critical infrastructure from insurgents. Moreover, they have a small but efficient air force with no attack capabilities, mainly used for rescue operations. Thus, they only operate 14 transport planes, 4 trainer jets, 1 special mission airplane, and 22 helicopters. As you can imagine, they have 0 tanks, no artillery whatsoever, and no military naval force. They only operate about 20 Coast Guard boats. After all, what's there to protect? Banana farms or deadly jungles? Not the most lucrative price for a full-scale invasion. However, Panama does have a tasty infrastructure that some of its neighbors might want to cease. The Panama Canal, for example, is one of the most important trading routes in the world. This quick connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific can be quite the treat and economic boost to anyone who owns it. So naturally, the US made sure to have the lion's share of this infrastructure, as they seized it during the 1990 intervention and forgot to leave. However, that's not the only thing protecting Panama from its neighbors. Nature itself does it pretty well. From the north, they border Costa Rica, which has also dissolved its army, so they pose no threat. From the south, Colombia might be a bit more dangerous in theory, as they are one of the biggest economies in South America and actually boast a formidable army. However, the border between the two countries is actually an impenetrable jungle that nothing can go through. No roads, railways, or even paths exist between the two nations. So, no blitzkriegs coming from the south anytime soon. Moreover, as we learned in recent years, many government officials from the most powerful country keep their dirty money in Panama, as they are tax-free. So if someone dares to attack Panama, they won't just face the 27,000 paramilitary troops, but probably a coalition of about 190 countries that will strive to protect their leaders' money from being captured. Now that's how you keep yourself independent, by being the dirty bank of the ultra-rich. Number 3. Suriname. Suriname is another prime example of a country with little potential for invasion. Why? Well, because of nature, of course. Nearly 90% of Suriname is covered with untouched rainforests, and the world desperately wants to keep them that way. Moreover, the Netherlands will definitely protect its former colony, which gained its independence as recently as 1975. So the Dutch still have way too much invested in the country to leave it be. More importantly, Suriname borders the EU through French Guiana, and you can bet that the French won't take it too kindly to have a war on their borders. So yes, Suriname is relatively safe, which can explain why their army poses less threat than the surrounding landscape. The Suriname army consists of a single light infantry battalion, a special force corps, and a military police corps. All in all, around 1,800 people are dedicated to protecting what's essentially several cities in a jungle. Naturally, they have no tanks or artillery since they can't operate them outside the cities, and boast around 600 operational vehicles, most of which are transport trucks left by the Dutch 50 years ago. Their air force is practically non-existent, as they operate only 3 search and rescue helicopters. One would think that a coastal country bordering the Atlantic Ocean, they might have a mighty naval force. Well, if 16 patrol vessels with practically no weapons are a mighty naval force, you'd be right. Naturally, their defense budget reflects their mighty army. With a $41.8 million annual budget, Suriname practically depends on its jungles to protect them. And let's be honest, it's far more terrifying to meet a jaguar than a Suriname troop. Moreover, the chances of meeting a deadly animal there are far bigger than ever meeting any military personnel, except the one that will actually come to rescue you. While Suriname has a good excuse to keep its military expenditure low, as they actually have nothing to fear other than nature itself, when it comes to our next entry, things are different. Number 2. Somalia. With a population of 12 million, over 1,800 miles of coastline, and nearly 400,000 square miles of land, one would think that Somalia will have one of the most formidable forces in Eastern Africa. Well, it's quite the opposite, actually. The military is not only one of the smallest, but is also famously laughably inefficient. In the late 80s, the army was standing on the edge of collapse, and in the early 90s, it took a bold step forward. Yes, in the 90s, the army was practically dissolved. That's hardly a surprise, as the local military was more like a gangster squad with heavy weapons than an actual protective force. With endemic corruption on every level, the Somalian army's main job was not to protect borders or civilians, but to murder, rape, loot, and commit heinous acts against its own population. A foreign diplomat famously said, "The inefficiency of the Somali armed forces is legendary." So, once the army got dissolved and Somalia plunged into chaos, it re-emerged back in 2006. But as you can imagine, it's not a frightening power that strikes fear in the hearts of its enemies, but more like a ragtag team of misfits that try to maintain some sort of stability in the country. With a defense budget of merely $64 million, their job is definitely not the easiest. If we disregard the incompetence, lack of financing, and equipment, the sheer numbers of the military are not so bad. The country has 17,500 active personnel, 300 of which are in the Air Force and 300 in the Navy. What these 300 people in the Air Force actually do is quite the mystery, as Somalia has absolutely no aircraft, no planes, no helicopters, nothing. Still, the Air Force gets around a fifth of the annual budget. Guess if they actually reach the Air Force. The 300 people in the Navy actually do have some jobs, though local pirates usually keep the Somali Navy in its ports. Still, they have 11 patrol vessels that predominantly operate near the land, so pirates won't attack them. However, the biggest chunk of its budget goes to the land forces. You might imagine they are a fearsome group that operates high-tech vehicles. Well, no. They don't even operate old Soviet tanks. They have no tanks, no artillery, nothing. They only operate around 1,500 transport vehicles, if they have the fuel. As you can imagine, soldiers often steal it and sell it on the black market for some serious profit. To top it all off, Somalia has no railway and waterway coverage. making supply lines relatively inefficient, especially with only 15,000 kilometers of roads in the entire country. So how do these guys actually stay independent? Beats me. My guess is that no one wants to deal with the local population, so they let them be. Moreover, with its starving people, whoever gets hold of this desolate land will have to solve so many problems that it's far better to let it be. Recently, US, Russian, British, Italian, French, and other ships began dispersing the pirates that were infesting the Somalian waters and disrupting local trade. Moreover, the US offered help in the late 2010s to eliminate various insurgents and train the military to deal with its domestic problems. Still, nothing can uproot the nation's corruption mentality, so Somalia will likely keep this position for quite a long time. Still, despite the many problems, at least Somalian soldiers can take pride that they are not the most useless military force in the world. This honor goes to number 1, Bhutan. I guess it's not a huge surprise that a country with a Minister of Happiness is not too keen on having a huge or effective military force. And when you're surrounded by the two most populous countries in the world, India and China, and you occupy some sharp rocks high in the Himalayan mountains, getting conquered is not something you think all that much about. Moreover, starting a nuclear war between India and China over who controls Bhutan is definitely not among the top priorities for both countries, so Bhutan is safe for now. Well, they did have to spring to action back in 2010 when a group of Indian separatists tried to invade and take control over the country. The mighty 5,000 personnel army managed to fend them off, with massive help from India and China, of course. Still, the $29 million annual budget seems like legitimate spending. I wonder what's the Ministry of Happiness budget for 2023? Naturally, as a landlocked country, Bhutan has no navy. And with such mountainous terrain, it's hard to imagine building a legitimate airstrip, let alone an entire air base. So, no air force as well. And who needs it? They have no chance against China or India's air forces, so it will be a waste of money. As you can imagine, with such terrains, armored vehicles like tanks and artillery are not quite efficient. The only thing they can do is start an avalanche, so Bhutan doesn't stock any of them. They only operate around 50 vehicles for transporting purposes. So what keeps them safe? Well, the status quo on one hand, nature on the other. But most importantly, they have barely any strategic value. The only resource they have in abundance is water, and if they restrain from building dams indiscriminately, they will probably never face any problems from either India or China. I can't decide whether it's good that you're safe because no one wants your land, or is it an insult to your country? Still, having an army like Bhutan's, it's probably best not to find out, as such a formidable force can be toppled in just a few hours by each of the best special military units in the world. Care to learn more about them?